When Shaquille O'Neal is accused of breaking into his own home, a routine morning spirals into a national controversy. Assumptions will be exposed, reputations will crumble, and one moment will change everything. Because in America, even being famous doesn't protect you from being seen as a threat. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal's life had always been larger than the court he dominated. To the world, he was Big Shaq, a giant in both stature and reputation, a retired NBA legend who had turned his success into business empires and philanthropic ventures. But beyond the headlines, beyond the flashing cameras and million-dollar deals, Shaq was something else entirely. He was a man who never forgot where he came from. Despite his wealth, despite his influence, Shaq had never lost his sense of self. He wasn't just another celebrity hiding behind iron gates and private jets. Instead, he spent his time giving back, mentoring kids, and ensuring that his success meant something beyond his own name. His newest home, a sprawling yet understated modern estate in Westbrook Heights, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the state, was just another chapter in his journey. But here, among the neatly trimmed hedges and towering white pillars, Shaq wasn't just a resident. He was a presence. And not everyone was comfortable with that. Westbrook Heights was a place of generational wealth and quiet exclusivity. The kind of neighborhood where names mattered as much as net worth, where families had lived for decades, passing down both their homes and their unspoken rules. Shaq had moved in a year ago, and while his presence was tolerated, it was never fully embraced. Some neighbors admired him, treating him as a novelty. "Oh look, Shaq lives on our street," while others barely concealed their unease. Microaggressions came wrapped in politeness. At a neighborhood event, a well-dressed woman had once smiled at him and said, "It must be so nice for you to live here. It's a big change, isn't it?" As if she wasn't sure he belonged. Another time, at the local grocery store, a man had given him a friendly nod before casually remarking, "Didn't expect to see you shopping here. Figured you had assistance for that." Shaq never reacted. He had seen it all before. But what stood out the most was the way some people looked at him. Not with admiration, but with calculation. As if trying to figure out how he fit into their world. Shaq didn't move to Westbrook Heights for validation. He wasn't looking for approval. He had chosen this place because it was close to the youth center he funded, where he spent his weekends coaching kids who didn't have access to expensive training programs. He lived here because it was convenient for his work, for the business meetings that shaped the companies he built from the ground up. But most of all, he lived here because he could. His success wasn't a gift, it was earned, built, fought for. And if that made people uncomfortable, well, that wasn't his problem. Yet no matter how much he tried to focus on his work, on his family, on the life he had built, he couldn't ignore the weight of certain stares. And no one stared more than Vivian Lancaster. Vivian had lived in Westbrook Heights for over 2 decades. In her mind, she was a guardian of the neighborhood, the silent enforcer of its unspoken traditions. From the moment Shaq moved in, she had been watching. At first, she told herself it was curiosity. But as the months passed, it became something else. A quiet, simmering resentment. Vivian prided herself on knowing who belonged and who didn't. Shaq? He was an outsider, no matter how famous, no matter how rich. His presence unsettled her. She saw him every morning on his runs, his towering figure moving effortlessly through the quiet streets. She saw him wave at neighbors, some returning the gesture, others hesitating. She watched him stop and talk to the local landscapers, joking with them like they were old friends, and she didn't like it. Vivian wasn't racist, she told herself. No. She just believed in order, in preserving the integrity of the neighborhood. And Shaq, big, loud, larger than life, he disrupted that. There was a particular moment that stuck with Vivian, one that shifted her curiosity into something sharper. One evening, a group of young boys from the youth center had visited Shaq's house. He had invited them over after practice for dinner, a reward for their hard work. They were good kids, smart, driven, respectful. But to Vivian, they were unfamiliar. She had stood at her window, watching as Shaq laughed with them, guiding them up his driveway. And in that moment, she felt something irrational rise inside her. It was the fear of change, of disruption, of something she couldn't control. She told herself she was just being cautious, concerned for the neighborhood, but deep down she knew the truth. She didn't want him here. And that, more than anything, made her dangerous. Shaq had felt it all year, the tension beneath the surface. But he didn't let it change him. He still walked to the corner store instead of ordering delivery. He still talked to the security guards at the community gates, learning their names, asking about their families. He still helped neighbors whenever they needed it. When Mr. Holloway, an elderly man down the street, struggled to move his heavy furniture, Shaq had been the first to offer a hand. When a kid's bike chain got jammed on the sidewalk, Shaq had crouched down and fixed it without a second thought. And yet, no matter how much he proved himself, no matter how normal his presence became, there were still those who saw him as a problem waiting to happen. On the surface, everything was fine. Shaq had learned to navigate these spaces, to ignore the stares and the hesitant smiles, to keep his head high. He focused on his work, his family, his mission. But deep down, he knew that no matter how much he tried to just exist, it only took one assumption, one false accusation, one bad decision to turn everything upside down. And soon, it would. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of sprinklers watering pristine lawns and the distant chatter of joggers making their usual rounds. The sky was a soft shade of blue, the kind that promised an uneventful, peaceful day. But for Shaquille O'Neal, today would be anything but normal. He pulled into his driveway, his sleek black SUV rolling to a stop as he exhaled deeply. The charity event he had just attended had been a success. Another scholarship fund secured, another group of kids given opportunities they never thought possible. It was the kind of work that mattered to him, the kind that made all the noise of the world fade into the background. He grabbed his duffel bag from the passenger seat, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped out. He was still in his gray hoodie, black joggers, and sneakers, a comfortable outfit for a man who preferred to keep things simple despite his wealth. Shaq walked up the pathway to his front door, reaching into his pocket for his keys, except they weren't there. He frowned, shifting the duffel bag and patting down his other pockets. Nothing. He sighed. Not again. It wasn't the first time Shaq had forgotten his keys inside. He wasn't used to carrying them. Most days, he had someone home or the garage door open. But today, his house was empty, and he had locked every entrance before leaving. He turned toward the side gate, the one leading to his backyard. There was a side entrance there, a door that led into his kitchen. He had left it unlocked before. Maybe he had gotten lucky this time. Shaq walked around the house, pushing open the gate with ease. His massive frame barely fit through the narrow pathway between the house and the fence, but he maneuvered it like he had done it a dozen times before. He reached the side door, gripped the handle, and pushed. Locked. Of course. He muttered under his breath and glanced up at the small window above the doorknob. It wasn't high. If he reached up, he could probably pop it open and unlock the door from the inside. Shaq backed up slightly, rising onto his toes, stretching his arm toward the window latch. It took a few seconds of maneuvering, but finally, click. The window slid open. He reached in, feeling for the lock. Across the street, behind the sheer curtains of her impeccably decorated front living room, Vivian Lancaster was watching. She had been watching since the moment Shaq pulled into his driveway. She always did. At first, she thought nothing of it. Just another morning, just another reminder that her exclusive, high-society neighborhood had changed. But then, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. Shaq wasn't going through his front door. He was sneaking around the side. Vivian narrowed her eyes, stepping closer to the window. She watched as he reached up toward the window latch, his large hands working at it. Her heart pounded. He's breaking in. That was the thought that filled her mind, unchecked, unquestioned, unfiltered. Vivian didn't think. She acted. She grabbed her phone, her fingers moving instinctively, confidently, as if she had been preparing for this moment all along. 911. The dial tone rang once, twice. 911, what's your emergency? Vivian's voice was steady, but beneath it was something rehearsed, something practiced. There's a man trying to break into a house across the street. Can you describe the individual? Vivian didn't hesitate. Tall, very large, black. He's wearing a hoodie. He's reaching into a window now. Please send someone quickly. The dispatcher responded with standard protocol, asking for an address, for further details. But Vivian's mind had already moved beyond the conversation. Her gaze remained locked on Shaq, completely unaware that his normal morning had just turned into something far more dangerous. With a final reach, Shaq's fingers brushed against the inside lock, flipping it open. The door clicked. He pulled his arm back, shaking it slightly before gripping the handle and pushing the door open. Finally, Shaq stepped inside, tossing his bag onto the kitchen counter and exhaling. Just another morning, another inconvenience handled. He poured himself a glass of water, leaning against the counter for a moment, checking his phone. A few emails, some texts from his business partners, a message from his mother, Lucille O'Neill, reminding him to call her later. Nothing out of the ordinary. He had no idea that outside his house, sirens were already approaching. No idea that a squad of officers was being dispatched under the assumption that he was a criminal. No idea that Vivian Lancaster was standing by her window, waiting to see justice unfold. The first squad car appeared at the end of the street, its lights flashing, cutting through the quiet morning like a blade. Then another, and another. The tires screeched slightly as they pulled up to Shaq's house, stopping abruptly in front of his driveway. 4 officers jumped out, moving in practiced formation, hands resting near their holsters. Across the street, Vivian folded her arms, satisfied. She had done her part. She had saved the neighborhood from whatever was about to happen. Now, all she had to do was watch. Shaq took another sip of water, setting the glass down just as something caught his attention. The sound of cars stopping abruptly outside. The low hum of voices, commanding, firm. Then, the blare of sirens. Shaq's body tensed. He turned toward the front of the house, stepping toward the window. Through the blinds, he saw them. Police officers, moving fast, toward his home. His heartbeat slowed, then quickened. This wasn't normal. He had lived here for over a year. The police had never come down this street like this. Then, just as the thought formed, a loud boom echoed through the air, a fist pounding on his front door. "This is the police! Step outside with your hands where we can see them!" Shaq's entire body went still. The weight of what was happening hit him all at once. And as the sirens flashed, as the officers shouted for him to come out, as his perfectly normal morning collapsed into something else entirely, one question filled his mind. What the hell just happened? Shaquille O'Neal had always been good at reading the energy in a room. On the basketball court, he could sense the shift in momentum before the crowd even reacted. In business meetings, he could tell when someone was holding back their real thoughts. It was a skill he had honed over years of being watched, analyzed, judged. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this. He had just poured himself a fresh cup of coffee when he heard them. Sirens. Not the distant hum of an ambulance on the freeway. Not the occasional patrol car rolling through the neighborhood. These were close. Fast. Aggressive. Coming straight toward his house. Shaq frowned, setting his mug down as he moved toward the window. His massive frame cast a shadow over the kitchen as he pushed the blinds aside and peered out. His stomach dropped. 3 squad cars, lights flashing, officers moving quickly, stepping out with purpose, urgency, and tension in their bodies. This wasn't a routine patrol. They were here for something. And then it hit him. They were here for him. Shaq's breath slowed, his hands resting on the counter as he took in the scene. The lead officer, Sergeant Cole, moved first. A tall, square-jawed man in his late 40s, Cole had the air of someone who had spent years giving orders and expecting them to be followed. His posture was stiff, rigid, his expression unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. The other officers fanned out behind him, hands hovering near their holsters, eyes scanning the house as if expecting movement inside. Something about it felt rehearsed, calculated, like they had already decided what they believed. Cole took a step forward, lifting his voice. "Shaquille O'Neal, step outside with your hands where we can see them." The words punched through the morning air, sharp and absolute. Shaq didn't move at first, not out of fear, No, this wasn't fear. This was calculation. He had been in situations before where his size, his presence, made people react before they thought. He knew that if he walked out too fast, moved the wrong way, looked anything other than calm, things could spiral. The street had started to come alive now. Neighbors peeked out from their windows. Some stepped onto their porches, phones in hand. A few murmured, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. And then there was Vivian Lancaster, standing on her porch, arms crossed, a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. She had done this. Shaq could feel it. The certainty, the entitlement, the belief that she had been right all along. And in that moment, something inside him hardened. He had a choice. He could react with anger, frustration, demand answers. Or he could do what he had always done, rise above it. Shaq inhaled deeply, rolled his shoulders, and moved toward the front door. Time to end this. As the door opened, the tension in the air tightened like a wire pulled too thin. Shaq stepped onto the porch, his massive frame immediately commanding attention. The sun hit his skin, highlighting the contrast between his dark hoodie and the bright, polished world of Westbrook Heights. He lifted his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in measured control. "Morning, officers." His voice was steady, even, but Sergeant Cole wasn't interested in pleasantries. "Keep your hands where we can see them," he ordered. Shaq arched an eyebrow but complied, his patience already being tested. "Can someone tell me what's going on?" Cole exchanged a look with one of the officers. His grip tightened on his belt. "We received a call about a possible break-in at this residence," he said. Shaq blinked. "A break-in?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You mean, my house?" Cole didn't flinch. "We need to confirm your identity and residence, sir." "Sir." The word sounded forced, a reluctant show of respect that didn't match the tone of the situation. Shaq held his ground, exhaling slowly. "My wallet's inside, but I think you already know who I am." A flicker of hesitation crossed Officer Riley's face, the younger cop standing slightly behind Cole. He was maybe mid-30s, not as rigid as the others. His brows furrowed slightly, like he was trying to process what was happening in real time. But Cole? Cole didn't hesitate. "Until we confirm, we need you to remain where you are." Shaq let the words settle between them. The unspoken message was clear. It didn't matter that he was famous. It didn't matter that his face had been on billboards, in commercials, in highlight reels for decades. Right now, he wasn't Shaquille O'Neal. He was just another black man being told to prove he belonged in his own home. Vivian Lancaster shifted on her porch, her arms still crossed but her expression less certain now. She had expected a quick resolution. Officers arrive, suspect detained, problem solved. But now, things weren't unfolding as neatly as she had imagined. Shaq wasn't panicking. He wasn't pleading. He was standing there, calm, in control. And people were watching. Some neighbors had stepped closer. A few had started recording. The quiet suburban street was no longer so quiet. Vivian swallowed, a flicker of doubt creeping into her chest. Had she miscalculated? Shaq didn't break eye contact with Cole. "Call dispatch," he said smoothly. "Run the property records. You'll see my name on them." Cole hesitated. This wasn't going how he had expected. He had walked into this situation already convinced of a certain narrative. Now cracks were forming in it. Behind him, Officer Riley stepped forward. "I can check it, sir." His voice was careful, controlled. "Won't take long." Cole shot him a look, but Riley was already reaching for his radio. There was a pause, a flicker of frustration in Cole's stance, but he nodded. "Fine. Run it." Shaq crossed his arms, waiting. Seconds ticked by. Then, the radio crackled to life. "Confirmed. Property is registered to Shaquille O'Neal." Silence. A heavy, thick silence that suffocated whatever authority the officers thought they had over this moment. Shaq exhaled slowly. "So, are we done here?" Cole's jaw tensed, but he gave a curt nod. "Seems like there was a misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. The word tasted sour, as if this had all been some minor inconvenience. As if Shaq hadn't just been forced to prove he wasn't a criminal in front of his own home. But he didn't press it. Because the truth was already visible, in the neighbors' faces, in the cameras still recording, in the uncertainty creeping into Vivian's expression. Shaq had already won. Vivian turned away, gripping the edge of her porch railing. The triumphant satisfaction she had felt just minutes ago was gone. She had called the cops to restore order. Instead, she had exposed herself. The world she had curated so carefully, the one where she got to decide who belonged and who didn't, had just collapsed. And now, everyone could see it. Shaq took one last look at the officers, then at Vivian, before turning and walking back into his house. He didn't need to say another word. The truth had already spoken for itself. Shaquille O'Neal stood on his front porch, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the pristine steps. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cars flickered against the white walls of his home, a sharp contrast between authority and ownership, suspicion and truth. The officers didn't lower their guard. They had gotten the call. They had arrived expecting a suspect. And now? They had a problem. Sergeant Cole adjusted his stance, his hand still resting near his holster, his eyes scanning Shaq from head to toe. His face betrayed no emotion, just cold calculation. The look of a man who wasn't ready to accept that he'd made a mistake. "We need to see some identification." Shaq exhaled slowly, his patience stretching thin. He had been here before. Different cities, different faces, but the same story. "Like I told you, my wallet is inside," Shaq said, his voice steady but edged with something firm. Cole didn't move. "Then we'll need you to step aside while we confirm your residency." Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying the officer as if trying to measure just how far this was going to go. "You want me to step aside from my own house?" he asked. "You're standing in my driveway, and you still don't believe I live here?" Cole's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, one of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably. Deputy Parker, standing just behind Cole, had been silent up until now. He was younger, maybe in his mid-30s, his uniform still crisp, his posture less rigid than the others. But there was something in his face. Hesitation, realization, maybe even regret. Because he knew who Shaq was. It was impossible not to. Parker had grown up watching Shaquille O'Neal dominate the NBA. He had his jerseys, his posters, had even saved up money as a kid to buy his first pair of Shaq sneakers. And now, here he was, watching his childhood hero being treated like a suspect in his own front yard. His fingers twitched near his radio, his mind racing between duty and conscience. Finally, he took a step forward. "Sarge, I think we should call this in. Get confirmation from dispatch," Parker said, his voice measured, controlled. Cole shot him a hard look. "We got a report of a possible break-in. We follow procedure." Parker hesitated. "Yeah, but nothing," Cole snapped. "Until we confirm otherwise, we proceed as planned." Shaq watched the exchange carefully. There it was, the moment where truth and ego collided. Shaq had dealt with a lot of people like Cole before. Officers who weren't interested in being right, just in not being wrong. This wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about control. Shaq took a slow step forward, his sheer presence making the space around him feel smaller. "Let me ask you something, officer," he said, his deep voice cutting through the tense silence. "If I was anyone else, would you still be questioning me right now?" Cole didn't answer. "If I was wearing a suit instead of a hoodie, if I was 5 inches shorter, 50 pounds lighter, would you still be asking for proof that I live in my own home?" Parker looked away. Some of the other officers shifted their weight. But Cole's face remained unreadable. "We're just doing our job," he said, but the words felt empty even as he spoke them. Shaq let them hang in the air, challenging them, waiting for someone, anyone, to acknowledge the absurdity of this situation. But before anyone could speak, the neighborhood began to take notice. Across the street, the first phone had already been raised. A neighbor, a man in his 40s with glasses and a concerned expression, was recording the entire scene. Down the block, Margaret Evans, an elderly woman who had been one of the first to welcome Shaq to the neighborhood, stood on her porch, arms crossed, her face set in quiet disapproval. More people began to step outside. Some watched from their driveways, others whispered among themselves. And then there was Vivian Lancaster, standing by her window, still clutching her phone as if the police needed her guidance on what to do next. Her expression had shifted from satisfaction to uncertainty. Because now, the story wasn't so easy to control anymore. Parker, still tense, pressed his radio. "Dispatch, confirm property records for 143 West Elm Drive," he said, his voice steady, but with a slight urgency. A moment passed, then another, then finally, the response. "Copy that. Property is registered to Shaquille O'Neal." Silence. Thick. Uncomfortable. Cole exhaled sharply, shifting on his feet. "Copy," he muttered into his radio. But the tension didn't break. Because now, everyone knew what this was, and no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Parker cleared his throat and looked at Shaq. "Sir, Shaq raised a hand, stopping him. He didn't need an apology. Not from Parker. Not from any of them. Because what could they say that would make this right? "You done here?" Shaq asked, his voice calm but edged with exhaustion. Cole hesitated before giving a reluctant nod. The officers started to step back, their hands finally moving away from their holsters. The tension slowly began to fade, but the damage was already done. The neighborhood had seen everything. And Vivian? She had nowhere to hide. Vivian's breath came shallow and fast as she stood frozen in place. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected confirmation, validation, proof that she had been right. But now people were looking at her. Not at Shaq. Not at the officers. At her. Margaret Evans shook her head in disgust before walking back inside her house. The man across the street kept recording, his phone still raised. And Vivian felt small for the first time in her life. She turned, gripping her door handle with fingers that suddenly felt weak. And without another word, she disappeared inside. The squad cars pulled away one by one, their sirens off now, as if they wanted to erase what had just happened. The neighbors began to retreat, the whispers lingering in the air. And Shaq? He stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The sun was brighter now, the morning fully awake, but it felt like the world had shifted just slightly. This was supposed to be his home, but today had reminded him he was still just a guest in the eyes of some. He exhaled, shaking his head. Then, without another glance at the house across the street, Shaq turned, stepped inside his home, and shut the door. Shaquille O'Neal had spent a lifetime commanding attention, on the court, in business, in life. But right now, he wasn't being seen. Right now, he was just another black man being asked to prove he belonged in his own home. And he was done with it. The street was silent, except for the low hum of police radios and the rustle of neighbors inching closer, their curiosity outweighing their caution. Sergeant Cole shifted his stance, his hand still hovering near his holster. He had expected compliance, a quick conversation, an ID check, and then back to their patrol. But Shaq wasn't playing along. "Sir, we need you to step away from the property until we verify your identity," Cole repeated, his voice sharp, controlled. Shaq didn't move. "I'm not stepping away from my own house." The words landed heavy, each syllable deliberate. His voice wasn't raised, but the authority in it was unmistakable. One of the younger officers, Parker, visibly hesitated. He was young, sharp, but clearly uncomfortable, his fingers flexing against his belt as if trying to find something to hold onto. Because he knew who Shaq was. The power in the situation had started to shift. The longer Shaq stood there, calm, unwavering, unafraid, the more obvious it became. This was wrong. Parker swallowed hard. "Sarge," he said carefully, glancing at Cole. "Maybe we should confirm with dispatch before this goes any further." Cole didn't respond. Because to acknowledge that would mean admitting this was a mistake. Shaq's eyes stayed locked on him. "You already know who I am," Shaq said, his voice low. "But you're waiting for me to flinch, for me to give you a reason to do what you came here to do." Cole's nostrils flared. That was too close to the truth. The tension thickened as more neighbors stepped out of their homes. Some held their phones up, recording the moment. Some quietly, some openly. Margaret Evans, an elderly woman who had always been friendly toward Shaq, shook her head from her porch. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. A few doors down, Jordan Wallace, a young entrepreneur in his late 20s, stood with his arms crossed, his phone streaming the situation live. "Man's lived here longer than some of y'all," he said to no one in particular. But not everyone saw it the same way. A couple of houses down, Daniel and Elise Carter, a middle-aged couple who often hosted neighborhood meetings, stood stiffly, whispering among themselves. "He should just show them his ID and be done with it," Elise murmured. "If he doesn't have it on him, how are they supposed to know?" Daniel added. And then there was Vivian Lancaster, standing frozen on her porch, watching her carefully curated reality slip away. Vivian had expected validation. She had expected the officers to remove the problem quickly, to handle the situation she had created. But now, the weight of so many eyes on her made her feel exposed, stripped of the power she had assumed was hers. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She needed to fix it, reframe it. She stepped forward, clearing her throat. I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said, her voice suddenly lighter, almost delicate. "I didn't mean for things to escalate like this." Shaq turned his head toward her, his gaze sharp. "Didn't you?" Vivian flinched, but she forced a tight-lipped smile. "I only called because I wasn't sure if you lived here," she insisted. "You have to understand, I was just looking out for the neighborhood." A scoff came from somewhere in the small crowd. "Margaret. Looking out for the neighborhood?" Margaret's voice cut through the air. "Or looking for a problem that wasn't there?" Vivian stiffened. "Excuse me?" Margaret stepped forward, arms crossed. "You knew exactly who he was. We all did. So why'd you assume the worst?" Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out, because there was no right answer. Meanwhile, Parker had made his decision. He stepped back, pressing his radio. "Dispatch. Confirm property ownership for 143 West Elm Drive." The response came within seconds. "Confirmed. Property belongs to Shaquille O'Neal." A pause. Then, another voice broke through the radio. "Did someone actually call this in?" Silence. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Cole's jaw locked. Shaq didn't move, didn't react. He just watched. Watched as Parker shifted in discomfort. Watched as Cole's pride warred with reality. Watched as Vivian shrank under the weight of her own actions. The officers had their confirmation. They knew the truth. And now, with cameras still rolling, with witnesses standing firm, they had no choice but to let go of the lie. Cole exhaled sharply. "We're done here," he muttered. The officers slowly backed away, their authority dissolving with each step. The flashing lights shut off. The radios quieted. And the neighborhood? The neighborhood had changed. Shaq stayed where he was, unmoving. He didn't need to yell, didn't need to argue, because the truth had already spoken for itself. Vivian turned away first, retreating into her home, closing the door as if it could shield her from the weight of what she had done. Cole and the officers followed soon after, their departure swift, almost desperate. One by one, the squad cars pulled away, disappearing down the street, leaving behind a silence heavier than the sirens that had preceded it. Shaq exhaled slowly, finally lowering his hands. Neighbors began to scatter, some retreating inside, some still lingering, processing what they had just witnessed. Margaret met his gaze and gave him a small nod, not of pity, but of solidarity. Jordan Wallace approached, shaking his head. "They really tried it," he muttered, "and she really thought she'd get away with it." Shaq didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. He turned, walking up the steps of his home, the same home he had walked into hundreds of times before. But this time, as he closed the door behind him, it felt different. Not because he had changed, but because now, everyone else had to. The tension in Westbrook Heights was suffocating. The police officers stood awkwardly near their squad cars, shifting their weight, their hands no longer near their holsters, but instead hanging at their sides like they didn't know what to do with them, because now they knew the truth. And there was no walking it back. The confirmation had come clear as day over the radio. "Dispatch, confirm property ownership for 143 West Elm Drive." A pause. Then the response that had changed everything. Copy that. Property is registered to Shaquille O'Neal. Silence had swallowed the street whole after those words. And then, the shift. The way the officers stood a little less firm, the way Sergeant Cole's jaw had clenched just a little tighter. The way Parker, the only officer who had actually questioned this mess, exhaled like he had been holding his breath the entire time. They had been wrong. They had known they were wrong before, but now? Now they had no excuse to pretend otherwise. Parker stepped forward first. He looked uncomfortable, like a man caught between his badge and his conscience. His fingers tapped against his belt, a nervous habit, as he glanced at Shaq before clearing his throat. "Sir, He hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened." Shaq met his gaze. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Parker saw it. The disappointment. Not anger, not rage, not an outburst. Just a deep, weighted disappointment that sat heavy in Shaq's eyes. Because this wasn't new for him. Because this was never going to be the last time. Shaq nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I know." Parker looked like he wanted to say more, to fix it somehow. But what was there left to say? So he just stepped back, leaving the weight of the moment where it belonged. Vivian Lancaster had never felt this exposed before. She had called this in. She had expected quick justice, immediate action, validation. Instead, she stood on her porch, watching everything she had built, her standing, her influence, her perception of control, crumble in real time. And she hated it. So she did what people like her always did when faced with undeniable proof of their wrongdoing. She played the victim. I just didn't know," she stammered, her voice louder now, reaching for the audience she knew was watching. "I was just trying to protect our neighborhood. I didn't mean for it to—" She stopped, realizing too late that no one was siding with her. No one was nodding in agreement. No one was stepping in to defend her. Instead, she saw the judgment, the disbelief, the quiet anger in her neighbors' faces. She had pushed too far. And now, she was alone. Margaret Evans, the elderly woman who had been watching the entire time, finally stepped forward. Her voice was sharp, unimpressed. "Vivian, you've lived across from this man for over a year. You knew exactly who he was." Vivian's face flushed. You just assumed he didn't belong," Margaret continued. "Because in your mind, people like him aren't supposed to live in places like this." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Jordan Wallace, still holding his phone, shook his head with a dry laugh. Wild how fast she called 911, but not once has she walked across the street and introduced herself. Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel the shift. Her authority, her influence, it was slipping. This wasn't her neighborhood anymore. Not in the way she had always believed. And that terrified her. Shaq had been silent through all of it, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had already said enough just by standing there, refusing to break. This moment wasn't about proving anything anymore, because the truth had already unfolded. There was no taking it back, no pretending it hadn't happened. He looked at Vivian once, not with anger, not even with pity, just with a look that told her she would have to live with this moment for the rest of her life. And then he turned, walked up the steps, opened his front door, and without another word, he stepped inside, leaving behind a neighborhood that would never look at itself the same way again. The silence in Westbrook Heights didn't last long. By the time Shaquille O'Neal closed his front door, the damage had already been done. Not to him, but to Vivian Lancaster. Because while the officers had walked away, while the neighbors had scattered, while the flashing lights had faded, the cameras had never stopped rolling. It started as a simple clip, a short, shaky video recorded on a neighbor's phone. The sound was muffled, but the images were crystal clear. Shaq standing firm in his own driveway, the officers questioning him, Vivian watching from her porch with smug certainty. It hit social media within hours. By morning, it had been shared by thousands. By midday, millions had seen it. The caption under most of the posts was simple but damning. "Imagine being Shaquille O'Neal and still having to prove you belong." News outlets picked it up fast. First local stations, then national headlines. NBA legend mistaken for intruder in his own home. Another case of racial profiling, this time with a celebrity. When being rich, famous, and respected still isn't enough. By nightfall, it was everywhere. And at the center of it all? Vivian Lancaster. Vivian had spent years building her life in Westbrook Heights. She was on community boards, hosted fundraisers, and made sure she was always seen in the right circles. But overnight, she had become something else entirely. The internet had a name for her now. Westbrook Karen. She saw the comments flooding in, her inbox filling with messages, some supportive, but most merciless. People called for her to resign from the neighborhood committee. Businesses she partnered with started distancing themselves. Her social invitations dried up. And worst of all, she wasn't in control of the story anymore. The media wanted Shaq's reaction. They wanted anger, outrage, a call for Vivian's complete destruction. But that wasn't who he was. When reporters reached out, he agreed to one interview. Sitting across from the anchor, Shaq leaned forward, his massive hands clasped together. His voice was steady, measured. "I appreciate the support," he said. "But this isn't just about me. What happened in my driveway happens every day to people who don't have cameras, who don't have millions of people ready to defend them. If this moment makes people think twice, if it makes someone hesitate before assuming the worst, then maybe something good can come from it." His words weren't for Vivian. They were for every person who had ever stood where he stood. Westbrook Heights was changing, not because everyone saw the problem, but because now no one could ignore it. Some neighbors held meetings to discuss moving forward. People like Margaret Evans and Jordan Wallace pushed for real conversations about bias in their community. Others, though, weren't so willing. A few residents defended Vivian, calling the backlash unfair, saying she was being punished for a mistake. One anonymous neighbor even told a local paper, "I don't think Vivian is racist. I just think people are overreacting." But the truth was clear. Westbrook Heights had been forced to confront something ugly, and there was no going back. Officer Parker had seen a lot in his years on the force. But what happened outside Shaq's house stayed with him. For days after, he found himself replaying the moment, the way Shaq stood there, knowing exactly what was happening, the way Sergeant Cole refused to back down, the way the system had been designed to work against people like Shaq, no matter who they were. And for the first time in his career, Parker asked himself a question he had never dared to before. Had he been part of the problem all along? He didn't have an answer yet. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to look away anymore. Vivian Lancaster had always believed herself to be a woman of status, influence, and control. But now she was a woman without a place. The neighborhood she had once ruled with subtle glances and whispered suggestions had turned its back on her. She had spent years crafting her image, hosting charity events, sitting on community boards, making sure she was the voice people listened to. But that voice had been silenced, because when people looked at her now, they didn't see a leader. They saw a cautionary tale. She had tried to go about life as usual, but everywhere she turned, the backlash followed. She walked into her favorite boutique, only to feel the hush that settled over the store. The owner, who once greeted her with warmth, gave her a polite but distant nod before turning away. At a charity luncheon, an event she had attended for years, she found her seat mysteriously unavailable, a quiet message that she was no longer welcome. Even the Westbrook Heights Community Board, where she had once held influence, had suggested she step back for the time being. It was a slow unraveling, a punishment not delivered through direct confrontation, but through absence, avoidance, exclusion. And the worst part? She couldn't play the victim. Because the world had seen the truth, and the world did not forget. Vivian had expected anger from Shaquille O'Neal. She had expected him to use his platform to bury her, to let the public outrage consume what was left of her reputation. But what she hadn't expected, what she couldn't have predicted, was his silence. Not silence in ignorance, silence in something else. And then, one morning, an email arrived. Not from a reporter, not from the community board, from Shaq. A single line. "Let's talk." Vivian sat across from Shaq in a small, quiet cafe. She felt small. Not because of his size, but because she had no defenses left. Shaq sipped his coffee, his face unreadable. He wasn't here to berate her or to gloat. He was here because that's who he was. Vivian swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I never meant for things to go that far, she said finally, her voice smaller than she intended. Shaq exhaled, nodding slowly. I know. The weight of those words settled between them. But that's the problem, isn't it? He continued. It never starts with people meaning for things to go that far. But they do. And they always have. Vivian gripped her coffee cup, her fingers tightening around the warmth. She wanted to push back, to defend herself, to explain that she wasn't a bad person. But for the first time, she didn't. Because she understood something she never had before. It wasn't about whether she was a bad person. It was about what she had done. I never thought of myself as someone who could, she trailed off, searching for the right words. Cause harm. Shaq studied her. That's the thing about harm, he said. It doesn't need your intention to be real. Vivian felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Guilt. But not just guilt. Understanding. For the first time, she truly saw it. She had seen a black man outside his home and assumed the worst. She had made a call that could have cost him his life, and she had been ready to move on like it was nothing. But now she couldn't. And maybe that was the beginning of something real. Meanwhile, Officer Parker had been wrestling with his own realizations. The viral footage had been everywhere, and while much of the public scrutiny had been on Vivian, he wasn't blind to his own part in it. He had stood there, badge on his chest, weapon on his belt, knowing what was happening was wrong, and still, he had hesitated. It kept him awake at night. Not because he feared backlash, but because he feared the truth. How many times had he let things like this happen before? Maybe not at this scale. Maybe not with someone famous. But how many times had he stayed silent? The realization sat heavy in his gut, and he knew he had two options. Ignore it, or do something about it. He made his decision. At the next department meeting, Parker stood up. We need to have a conversation about implicit bias training. The room fell silent. Some of his colleagues shifted in their seats, others looked away, but Parker didn't waver. We're supposed to serve and protect, he continued, but that only works if we're willing to admit when we get it wrong. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. Shaq didn't expect Vivian to change overnight. He didn't expect the police force to suddenly fix its flaws, but he had spent his life breaking through barriers. And if there was one thing he knew, it was this. Change doesn't happen through destruction. It happens through conversation, through accountability, through showing up, even when it's uncomfortable. Westbrook Heights would never be the same. Neither would Vivian. Neither would Parker. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The weeks following the incident at Westbrook Heights were not filled with grand apologies or sweeping declarations of change. But something had shifted. Not in a way that was loud or immediate. Real change never worked like that. It was in the small things. The way some neighbors paused before making assumptions. The way conversations that had once been avoided were now being had. The way Westbrook Heights no longer felt as comfortable in its ignorance. Some people still whispered about it. Some still defended Vivian, calling it a mistake, an overreaction. But others? They had seen too much to ignore it. A few neighbors who had stood on the sidelines that day started attending community discussions on racial bias, hosted at the local library. At first, the meetings were awkward, tense, but over time more people showed up. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to understand. Margaret Evans, the elderly woman who had been one of the first to speak up, became a regular. So did Jordan Wallace, the young entrepreneur who had filmed the entire thing. Even Daniel Carter, who had once murmured about Shaq just showing his ID and moving on, found himself listening more than speaking. Westbrook Heights wasn't fixed, but it was changing. Through it all, Shaq kept moving forward. The world had wanted his reaction, wanted him to call for Vivian's complete downfall, wanted him to make this the defining moment of his life. But that wasn't who he was. He had spent too many years building, lifting, teaching to be pulled into something so small as revenge. So he continued his work at the youth center, coaching kids, making sure they knew their worth before the world had a chance to tell them otherwise. He spoke at a few schools, not about what had happened, but about what needed to happen next. "It's not about proving who you are to people who refuse to see you," he told a group of students one afternoon. "It's about knowing who you are, so that when moments like this happen, you don't let them define you." The students nodded, taking in every word, because they understood. Even the ones who hadn't lived it yet knew it was coming. Vivian Lancaster didn't disappear from the neighborhood. She could have. She had considered it. But leaving wouldn't erase what she had done. So instead, she forced herself to sit with it. One evening, after much hesitation, she walked into one of the community discussions. At first, the room went still. People noticed her. Some whispered, some frowned, but no one told her to leave. So she sat, her hands folded in her lap, her breath steady but shallow. She didn't speak. She just listened. And for the first time in her life, she realized how little she had understood the world outside her own. She wasn't forgiven. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she was there, and that was the first step. Officer Parker followed through on his word. It wasn't easy. Bringing implicit bias training into the department was met with resistance. Some officers didn't want to hear it, didn't want to believe that they played a role in something broken. But Parker pushed. He made sure the training was implemented. He made sure the conversations weren't just for show. And when a rookie officer pulled him aside after one session, hesitating before admitting, "I never thought about it like that before," Parker knew. It was working. Slowly, but surely. As the sun began to set over Westbrook Heights, Shaq stood in his driveway, looking out at the neighborhood that had once made him feel like an outsider in his own home. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good yet. But it was trying. And that was more than he had expected. He exhaled, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Because if there was one thing he had learned over the years, it was this. Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens one conversation at a time, one action, one choice. And today was a start. How many stories like this happen without a camera rolling? How many moments of quiet injustice go unnoticed, unchallenged? This isn't just about one neighborhood. It's about the world we choose to live in. Next time, ask before you assume. Speak up before you stay silent. Because the real change? It starts with you.